No one expected the air in that hearing room to feel like the edge of a cliff, but that's exactly what it became. A national congressional hearing live-streamed to millions wasn't supposed to turn into a showdown. But today wasn't ordinary. Today was theater, politics, and reckoning all wrapped into one. And at the center of it all, Senator John Kennedy and Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. He came in confident, even amused. Known for his silver-tongued Southern charm and courtroom zingers, Senator Kennedy had one goal: to make Crockett look like an amateur. He'd done it before with others. He knew how to turn complex hearings into viral sound bites. To him, this wasn't justice, it was strategy. And she was just the next target. Crockett, on the other hand, sat quietly across the polished mahogany table. No showmanship, no pretense, just stillness. A navy blue blazer, a poised expression, and a quiet fire behind her eyes. She wasn't here to perform. She was here to protect something bigger than herself, her voice, her district, and the people who never get invited into these rooms. Camera zoomed in. Journalists leaned forward. The hum of whispers faded as the chair called the session to order. Then came the moment. Senator Kennedy cleared his throat with just enough theatrical flair to draw the room's full attention. "Well now, Congresswoman," he began, his voice drenched in syrupy condescension. "You've certainly made a name for yourself with some creative interpretations of the Constitution." A few low chuckles floated from his side of the aisle. Crockett didn't blink. "I'd just like to ask you a few questions. Not a trap, of course," Kennedy added, grinning. "Just to gauge your legal comprehension." Everyone in that room knew what was coming. "Do you believe the Constitution allows Congress to use federal funds for abortion?" The trap was laid, loaded, political dynamite wrapped in legalese. But Crockett leaned in just slightly, calm, focused. "Senator," she said clearly, "reproductive rights are constitutional rights, but the Hyde Amendment already restricts federal funding. That's not a misunderstanding of law. That's a matter of public policy." A beat of silence. Then Kennedy smirked. "Well, you say policy. Some might say ignorance." Gasps. But Crockett didn't flinch. She folded her hands, lifted her chin, and answered without raising her voice. "And some might say condescension is a poor substitute for a real argument, Senator." The room shifted. The storm had officially begun. Senator Kennedy leaned back in his chair, lips curled in a self-satisfied smirk. He had thrown the first jab, and in his mind, the game was already his. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't rattled. She didn't rush. She didn't flinch. She sat perfectly still like a chess player waiting for her opponent to realize he'd made a mistake 3 moves ago. Kennedy, sensing the shift, pushed forward. "Let's try something a little simpler," he said, rifling through a stack of papers with deliberate rustling. "Here's a quote from one of your recent interviews. You said, and I quote, 'The Constitution wasn't written with people like me in mind.' Care to explain that? Creative perspective." The room hushed. It was a setup, not a legal question, an emotional ambush. One meant to paint her as radical, ungrateful, divisive. But Jasmine leaned in, not defensively, not apologetically, just with quiet certainty. "I meant what I said," she replied. "When the Constitution was signed in 1787, people who looked like me, black people, women weren't recognized as full citizens. That's not a political opinion. That's a historical fact." Kennedy opened his mouth, but she didn't give him the chance. "But the beauty of our country is that we evolve," she continued. "We passed amendments, we fought civil rights battles. The Constitution was never a finished painting, it's a living document, and I'm living proof of that evolution." Silence, thick and total. A senator 2 rows down shifted uncomfortably. A staffer looked away. The audience wasn't laughing anymore. Kennedy's jaw tightened. "So, you believe the Constitution should be reinterpreted whenever it suits someone's feelings?" Jasmine smiled, not with mockery, but with control. "No, Senator. I believe the Constitution must be interpreted with context, integrity, and an understanding that justice delayed is justice denied." She paused. "There's a reason Brown versus Board of Education overturned Plessy versus Ferguson. The times changed, and the courts had to catch up." The moment cracked open. The senator's usual rhythm sarcasm, Dismissal, smug superiority wasn't landing. And Jasmine? She wasn't just answering his questions. She was rewriting the tempo of the room. He tried one more time. Isn't constantly bringing race into these hearings divisive? This time, her answer hit like thunder. Pretending race doesn't shape our institutions is how we got here in the first place, Senator. The chamber froze. She wasn't sparring anymore. She was delivering truth with surgical precision. And Senator Kennedy didn't realize the storm he thought he was steering had already changed direction. The chamber had grown still not out of boredom, but reverence. Something had shifted. Even Kennedy could feel it. He cleared his throat, masking discomfort behind his signature grin. But his voice betrayed him. So, I take it you believe America is inherently racist? A hush fell. That was the question. The one meant to break her, paint her as extreme, isolate her from the mainstream. But Jasmine didn't blink. I believe, she began slowly, that systems built without the voices of all people will reflect the blind spots of those in power. That's not the same as calling every person racist. That's a call for accountability. A few staffers exchanged glances. Someone in the gallery scribbled faster. Kennedy tapped his pen nervously. You're good at dodging questions, he said. Crockett leaned in, not with heat, but with precision. No, Senator. I'm good at answering them with nuance. Sorry if that's unfamiliar territory. There it was. Not a roar. Not a mic drop. Just a scalpel sliding under the surface. The room stirred. Kennedy wasn't used to this being outmaneuvered without theatrics. His old playbook wasn't working. Still, he tried again. Well, he chuckled dryly, I suppose we'll agree to disagree. Some call it policy. I call it rewriting history. Crockett smiled, this time with calm defiance. And some call it rewriting history when women speak plainly and are called creative instead of informed. But I'll take that as a compliment. A soft clap from the gallery. Kennedy whipped his head around. Decorum, please, he barked. But it was too late. He was no longer controlling the room. Crockett was. She sat back, steady as stone. No triumphant grin, no smirk. Just the quiet dignity of someone who came prepared for war but chose discipline over destruction. Across the aisle, a Republican aide whispered, She's winning. Kennedy adjusted his glasses, avoided eye contact. The committee chair looked uncomfortable, ready to pivot, but Kennedy wasn't done. His pride wouldn't allow it. He signaled he had one more round of questions. The chair, begrudgingly, gave a nod. But now, the whole room knew this wasn't about oversight anymore. This was about recovery. About a seasoned senator scrambling to regain ground he'd already lost. And Jasmine? She didn't flinch. She simply opened her binder, pen in hand, and waited. Because while he was busy trying to rescue his ego, she was still focused on something far greater. The truth. Senator Kennedy wasn't just bruised, he was embarrassed. And when pride feels cornered, it strikes low. He leaned forward, voice softening into a mockery of concern. Well now, Congresswoman, you talk a good deal about struggle and injustice. But let's take a closer look, shall we? Crockett raised an eyebrow. You're a lawyer, a state legislator, now a member of Congress. By most accounts, you've succeeded. And yet, you speak as if you've never had a seat at the table. Isn't that a little performative? There it was. A personal blow cloaked in civility. Kennedy wasn't questioning her ideas anymore. He was questioning her right to express them. The insult wasn't loud, but it was sharp. He was suggesting that because she'd made it, her voice on inequality no longer held weight, that her success disqualified her from speaking for those still struggling. The room held its breath. Jasmine sat still for a moment, letting the silence stretch until it became power. Then she spoke out quickly, not angrily, but with calm, deliberate fire. That's funny, Senator, she said, because last I checked, success isn't a muzzle. A pause. See, I didn't grow up in a marble hall. I didn't inherit power. I earned it. And with every step I climbed, I brought my community with me. Her voice gained quiet strength. I watched kids in my neighborhood get written off before they ever got a chance. That's why I went to law school. Not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. Kennedy opened his mouth to respond, but Crockett continued, her voice slicing through the room like a scalpel. You call that performative? She said. I call that purpose. Murmurs echoed. A few heads turned. Someone in the back whispered, "She's not playing." "And if empathy offends you," she added, "maybe it's because you've never had to survive what others are still fighting through every single day." Now, even the people behind Kennedy had stopped shifting in their seats. He tapped his notes, but they suddenly looked empty. Crockett leaned back, never raising her voice, never once breaking composure. And yet, she was commanding the room. It wasn't charisma. It wasn't volume. It was presence. Truth, spoken so clearly, it cut through every tactic designed to shut it down. She had just flipped his insult into a mission statement. And now everyone was listening not because they had to, but because they couldn't look away. Kennedy leaned back, straightened his papers, and flashed a grin meant to signal composure. But everyone in the room could feel it. The tide had turned, and he didn't like it. Still, the senator wasn't about to retreat. No, he reached for something heavier, his legal playbook. With a flick of his wrist, he pulled out a thick folder. "Let's move past speeches and sentiment," he said, feigning indifference. "Since you're so confident in your legal knowledge, let's test that." Crockett didn't react. Her pen hovered, ready. Kennedy lifted a page. "This is your co-sponsored bill, H.R. 8072, he said, waving it like a trap waiting to snap. Page 27, Section 3, Subsection B. It references compelled testimonial immunity in administrative disciplinary procedures. Could you explain how that aligns with current DOJ guidelines, specifically, whether it conflicts with binding Supreme Court precedent?" The room froze. Even seasoned attorneys might have hesitated. The language was dense, the aim clear. Overwhelm her, confuse the viewers, make her stumble. He smiled, a full, confident smile. But Jasmine only nodded once, then spoke with the steady rhythm of someone who'd already studied the play and memorized the ending. "Thank you for the question, Senator," she began. "I'm glad you brought up Garrity versus New Jersey 385, U.S. 493. Kennedy blinked. In Garrity, the court held that public employees can't be compelled to make incriminating statements during investigatory interviews. If they are, those statements are inadmissible in criminal court. She turned slightly, now addressing the full committee. Our bill uses that precedent to ensure that civilian review boards don't unintentionally coerce testimony during internal affairs investigations. We define the difference between administrative discipline and criminal liability. That's not a loophole, Senator. That's legal compliance." Murmurs spread across the room. "And as for the DOJ," she continued, "their post-2016 revisions explicitly permit oversight boards as long as they uphold constitutional protections. We cite those protections twice. Once in Section 3, again in Section 7 under due process." A long pause. Jasmine leaned back. "So no, Senator, it doesn't conflict with precedent. It reinforces it. And if you'd read beyond subsection B, you'd have seen that." A single clap echoed from the gallery before the chair struck the gavel. Kennedy's face flushed. His fingers twitched over now useless notes. He had thrown a legal grenade in. Jasmine had handed it back, disarmed, labeled, and cataloged. In under 2 minutes, she didn't just survive the ambush. She made it look like he hadn't done his homework. The silence that followed was deafening. Senator Kennedy, a man known for quick wit and sharp jabs, now sat motionless like a stage actor who'd forgotten his next line. His legal ambush had backfired. Badly. Reporters furiously typed. A camera light blinked red. The hearing was still rolling, but Kennedy's momentum wasn't. He tried to pivot. "Well," he muttered with a forced chuckle, "that's a lovely lecture, Congresswoman. But let's not lose sight of the real issues here. This hearing isn't a law school seminar. It's about accountability, fiscal responsibility, public safety." Crockett tilted her head slightly, waiting. Kennedy leaned in again, hoping charm would cover retreat. "We've got crime skyrocketing, families struggling, cities overwhelmed. And you want to split hairs over technicalities and case law?" He smiled, as if he'd scored a point. But the audience wasn't smiling. They'd seen what just happened. And Jasmine Crockett wasn't about to let the deflection slide. She leaned forward, voice low, composed, surgical. "Senator, you're the one who asked the question. You requested specificity. You challenged my understanding of constitutional law. And when I answered precisely, thoroughly, you dismissed it as trivia. A murmur from the left side of the room. Crockett continued, steady as a metronome. So which is it? Do you want substance? Or do you just want sound bites? Boom. A Republican staffer glanced sideways. A Democratic aide stifled a smile. Kennedy straightened in his chair, clearly rattled. I'm just a simple country lawyer, he replied, voice shaking ever so slightly. I don't pretend to speak in Harvard tongues. Crockett didn't miss a beat. You don't need Harvard, she said. You need consistency, honesty, and the courage to engage on facts instead of fallback slogans. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't loud, but it landed with force. Kennedy's face twitched. His pen tapped rhythmically against the table, a silent drum of frustration. Crockett wasn't just defending herself anymore. She was setting a standard and the room was watching her do it. We are here, she continued, eyes sweeping across the committee, because the American people expect seriousness. They expect us to do more than recycle talking points. Another ripple moved through the gallery. One aide whispered, "This is going viral." Kennedy sat still, lips pressed tight, the usual gleam in his eyes replaced by calculation. He had tried to dismiss her expertise. Now he was being defined by her clarity. And the more he tried to pivot away, the deeper he sank into irrelevance. By now, the hearing room didn't feel like a courtroom. It felt like a turning point. Kennedy was still speaking, but no one was leaning in. All eyes had moved to Jasmine Crockett. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't insulted anyone, and yet she was winning a battle Kennedy didn't realize he'd already lost. Still, he tried one more time. Well, Kennedy said, adjusting his tie, I just think the average American is less interested in constitutional parsing and more concerned about rising crime, especially in cities like yours. There it was, again, a soft accusation, coated in feigned concern, a setup, a way to corner her without saying it outright. Your district is broken, and it's your fault. Crockett didn't flinch. I've spoken out about crime in my city, she said clearly. I've worked with local leaders to support both policing and prevention. But let's be honest, what some people call tough on crime is just code for avoiding the root causes. The room shifted again. I won't weaponize fear, she continued, just to score points on camera. Kennedy leaned in, voice sharpening. Then what would you call it when businesses are looted and police are attacked? Are you saying the system made them do it? Crockett's eyes didn't move from his. I'm saying the system failed long before the windows broke. A beat. It failed when schools were underfunded, when wages stagnated, when healthcare became a luxury, when housing became a crisis. And then we act surprised when despair turns to desperation. Gasps rippled across the gallery. Crockett didn't stop. Accountability matters, but so does empathy. And if we keep treating symptoms without addressing the disease, we're not solving anything. We're just performing outrage. A staffer behind Kennedy looked down, embarrassed. Even one of his colleagues shifted uncomfortably in their seat. Kennedy opened his mouth but couldn't find a thread. Crockett leaned forward, voice steady as stone. You want to reduce crime? Start by restoring dignity. Start by believing that poor neighborhoods deserve more than police cars and boarded-up clinics. It wasn't a speech. It was a truth no one else had dared say aloud in that room. And it hit harder than any soundbite. Crockett wasn't fighting for applause. She was fighting for people Kennedy had never matanned, maybe never even noticed. And at that moment, even some of his own side started to wonder, were they watching a hearing or witnessing a shift in power? Senator Kennedy was running out of moves. His folder of questions was thinning. His tone, once sharp and smug, was starting to fray at the edges. But desperation has a voice and it often tries to sound like authority. He leaned forward, narrowing his eyes. You know, Congresswoman, empathy is all well and good in a speech, he said, voice smooth with condescension. But what I find interesting is how someone with your background law degree, elected office, national platform still, talks like she's an outsider. Crockett's expression didn't change. I mean, he continued, pressing the point, if you've already made it, why keep acting like you haven't? That was the swing, not at her ideas, but at her identity. He was suggesting she had no right to speak about injustice, that her success was proof she didn't understand struggle. The room went still. Jasmine folded her hands, her gaze fixed and calm. "That's the problem right there," she said softly. "You think because I've made it into this room, I'm supposed to forget the people who never even got close to the door." A ripple passed through the back row. "You assume that success erases memory, that titles erase truth. But they don't." Her voice rose not in volume, but in clarity. "I didn't grow up with a safety net. I didn't inherit a law firm. I had to fight for every degree, every opportunity. And when I speak about struggle, I'm not reading it from a memo, I'm remembering it from my own life." Kennedy opened his mouth to interrupt, but Crockett kept going. "I speak this way because I know what it feels like to be underestimated. I know what it feels like to walk into rooms where people think your presence is the mistake." The silence thickened. "You call that performative?" she said, locking eyes with him. "I call it honest. I call it necessary." A reporter in the corner typed the quote word for word. "And if being honest about where I come from makes you uncomfortable, then maybe it's not me who needs to adjust." Kennedy blinked. She hadn't just answered him, she had exposed the assumptions behind his question. The gallery didn't clap. They didn't have to. The silence said it all. Because in that moment, Jasmine Crockett stopped being a witness at a hearing. She became a mirror, and Kennedy didn't like what he saw staring back. Senator Kennedy shifted in his seat. The room had slipped out from under him, and he knew it. His lines, once greeted with chuckles and nods, now landed with a hollow thud. But pride is persistent, and Kennedy still had one card left theatrics. He leaned into the microphone, voice dipped in mock sincerity. "Well, Congresswoman," he began, "I must say, if I wanted a performance like this, I'd have gone to Broadway." A few weak laughs sputtered from his side of the aisle. "But I suppose that's the new game," he continued. "Big words, bigger speeches, and very little substance." He gestured dramatically to the room. Meanwhile, the real issue crime, broken schools, border chaos go untouched. But at least the television cameras get a good show. It was meant to dismiss everything she'd said, reduce her precision, her preparation, her composure to nothing more than political theater. And then he crossed the line. "Frankly, I don't know if your constituents tuned in for a legal seminar or the next Netflix drama," he said, smirking. "But either way, you've got real stage presence." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was electric. Jasmine Crockett didn't speak right away. She sat still, eyes locked on him. No anger, just purpose. Then she spoke slowly. Clearly, with the weight of someone who had waited her whole life to answer that exact insult. "Senator," she said, "you may think this is theater, but for people like me, this is survival." The room stopped breathing. "You mock how I speak, how I show up, how I use the law, but you don't understand the cost of getting here." She leaned forward barely, but it felt seismic. "I didn't get here on family money. I didn't ride in on legacy. I got here through late nights, open wounds, and doors that had to be kicked open." Her voice sharpened, not with heat, but with resolve. "And when I speak, it's not for performance. It's for the single mother in my district working 3 jobs to afford insulin. It's for the high schooler in a crowded classroom who's already being told he's not enough. It's for everyone who's ever been told they don't belong at this table." The silence was thunderous. "And then," she added calmly, "so if that makes you uncomfortable, maybe it should." Kennedy said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. He had tried to reduce her to a role. Instead, she became the moment. The chair banged the gavel. Once, twice, trying to contain what was already uncontainable. But the energy had shifted completely. Jasmine Crockett didn't just win the exchange. She'd rewritten the dynamic of the entire hearing. The audience no longer saw a sparring match. They saw a reckoning. And Senator Kennedy was now a man looking for an exit. He adjusted his glasses, fumbled with his notes, and muttered into the mic, "Well, that was quite the presentation." But his voice cracked not from emotion, but from exposure. He had nothing left. No counter, no recovery. Just a fading spotlight that refused to follow him anymore. Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She simply turned back to the microphone and delivered the final truth not for him, but for everyone watching. "You know, she said, voice calm. There's something I've learned over the years. The room leaned in. It's not about how loud you are or how clever your comebacks are. It's about what you stand for when no one's clapping. She looked toward the back rows, the aides, the interns, the forgotten faces watching history be made. I didn't come here to be liked. I came to be heard. For the mother who can't afford her prescriptions. For the kid who studies by candlelight. For the people told they're too angry, too unpolished, too different to lead. Her voice caught not from nerves, but from truth. And to anyone who's ever been mocked, ignored, or told they didn't belong, you do. You always did. And no amount of sarcasm can erase that. The crowd didn't wait for permission this time. Applause erupted, first hesitant, then rising. It wasn't political, it was human. One member of the gallery stood up, then another, and another. Senator Kennedy stared ahead, unmoving, a man no longer in command of the room or the moment. Jasmine Crockett remained seated, steady, unbothered. Because this wasn't about a headline. It was about a turning point. In the hours that followed, clips of the hearing exploded across social media. Hashtags surged, edits were made, memes shared, but one phrase lingered longer than all the sound bites. You may think this is theater. For me, it's survival. It wasn't just a comeback. It was a confession, a challenge, a call. And for anyone who's ever been underestimated, those words didn't just echo. They landed. Because when truth speaks with clarity, it doesn't need to shout. It simply stands. And the whole room listens,